In this video, we are going to look at a couple different aspects of biology. The first is how all living things have certain characteristics in common. Then we're going to look at unifying principles of biology. And then lastly, we're kind of going to look at how life gets organized. So to start off, biology is the science of life. So remember that the prefix bio means life, and the suffix ology means study of. So biology is the study of life. And so in order to be classified as a living thing, an object must have all 6 of the following characteristics. So the first thing that they must be able to do is respond to the environment. They have to be able to grow and reproduce. They must produce offspring. They have to be able to maintain homeostasis. They have a complex chemistry. And then lastly, they must consist of cells. So now we're going to take a look at each of these in a little more detail. So the ability to respond to the environment is really the ability to detect changes in the environment and then respond to them. So what happens if you step on a rock? From the rock's perspective, does the rock feel anything? So from the rock's perspective, it doesn't feel anything. It doesn't react in any which way. However, so from the rock's perspective, nothing happens. From if you step on a turtle, from the turtle's perspective, it's going to respond to that added pressure. It might tuck its head inside its shell, so it might hide in the shell, or it might have some other response. And so this is why we know that a turtle is living versus a rock, because the turtle has the ability to respond to the environment. Living things have the ability to grow and develop, and so when an organism grows, it can either increase the total number of cells, and that would be in the case of a multicellular organism, or if it's single cellular, a single cell can grow bigger in size. And so both of these processes require some sort of development, where here in the diagram it takes you from a frog egg to the tadpole stage and eventually up into the adult frog. And this is a development. And all the while through these stages, the frog is also growing. And in this case, it's increasing the number of cells. This kind of ties in with reproduction. Living things have to be able to reproduce. This is the process by which living things give rise to offspring. It can be as simple as the single cell dividing to form 2 identical daughter cells, or it could be much more complex, which is much more common, and that could be part of the sexual reproduction and combining genes from 2 parents, which then produces unique offspring. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain an internal environment regardless of what's happening outside of that body. So humans maintain a stable body temperature. Even if you go outside when it's cold, your inside should always be around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And if it's really hot outside, your body will start to sweat in order to help you maintain and cool down your internal body. Living organisms have a complex chemistry. And this means that they have large and complex molecules. And they can undergo complicated chemical changes in order to stay alive. So this really has to do with your metabolism and the use of organic molecules. And then lastly, in order to be considered alive, you also have to be made up of cells, at least one cell. And a cell is the basic unit of the structure and function of living things. Organisms may appear very different on the outside, but their cells are actually very similar. So if you look at the diagram here, we have a human cell versus an onion cell. And you should be able to see that both of these cells, both the animal and the onion cells, have a nucleus. And really the only very visible difference is the shape. And you might say, well, the one is green and the other is blue. And that really only has to do with how the scientists who prepared those slides dyed the stain, or what color stain they used in order to make these slides. So then our next thing we're going to look at are the 4 unifying principles of biology. And these are the basic concepts that tie all aspects of biology together. So the first is the cell theory, then we have gene theory, homeostasis, and lastly we have evolution. So the cell theory states that some living organisms remain single-celled, but all living things are made up of cells. Living cells have to come from other cells, and other cells can grow and develop into many cells. So like the human body has up to 100 trillion cells, whereas like a single-celled bacteria, like the bacteria that causes strep throat, is just a single-celled organism. But these 2 bullets right here are your main components of the cell theory. Gene theory states that the idea that characteristics of living things are controlled by genes. Genes are located on structures called chromosomes. Each species has a unique unique number of chromosomes, and so it's very particular to the species. Chromosomes contain large molecules of DNA, and then the DNA is coded with instructions that tell the cells what to do. And so a gene is really a long stretch of DNA that carries instructions. And sometimes a better way to think about it is even like a recipe for something to make. It needs to do something. Homeostasis is not just a characteristic of living things. Homeostasis is found just in the natural world in general. So for example, the atmosphere maintains homeostasis in that oxygen makes up 21%, and it doesn't really matter where you are on the earth, that oxygen is going to make up that 21%. And it's kept constant because of living things performing photosynthesis, which puts oxygen into the atmosphere, where cellular respiration takes oxygen out of the atmosphere. And so these 2 processes work hand in hand to keep the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere at that pretty consistent 21%. The last unifying principle of biology is evolution. Evolution states that it is the change of characteristics of living things over time, and this explains how living things are changing and the history of life on Earth. The process through which evolution occurs is called natural selection. And so this is when organisms better suited to their environment live on to reproduce, and then pass on their genes, whereas organisms less well suited to survive in their environment do not live in long enough to pass on their genes. Over many generations, this can lead to major changes in the characteristics of living things. So a way to kind of think about this is if you have like a rabbit with white fur is going to be better suited to live in an environment that is snowy versus a rabbit with black fur would be better suited for an environment, maybe a woodsy environment. It has better camouflage. So all living things evolve because environments are constantly changing. They could be changing because of natural events, or they could be changing because of humans. And so in order to evolve, you have to be able to adapt or adjust to these changing environments. So moles, they live underground, and they rely on their sense of touch and not so much on their sense of sight because it's dark. So their eyes are pretty much useless, yet they've evolved this fingery appendage so they can feel many different ways and locations underground. All living things depend on their environment to supply them with food, water, and shelter. And so when those environments change, the organisms must also change or they will die. The environment will consist of physical features or factors like water is a physical feature, rocks, soil, pretty much anything that is not living. So an organism is an individual living thing. So you yourself are considered an organism because it's just you. Many organisms interact with each other and their environment, and they may rely on each other for survival. So for example, living things that can't make their own food within their own body rely on other organisms that can. So this would be example of plants or organisms that can do photosynthesis. Whereas things that cannot make their own food are called consumers because they must eat other organisms. So this relationship between different organisms of different species is called a symbiosis. And with a symbiosis, at least one of the organisms must benefit. The second organism can either benefit or it could be harmed. So for example, the birds and the deer in the picture, the birds pick out food from the deer's fur, typically like bugs and gross things like that. So the deer benefits because they get cleaned pretty much, and the birds benefit because they get food and they get a free ride to wherever that deer is going. So this is an example of a win-win symbiosis. Competition can occur between living things, and this will happen when the two species or the two organisms rely on the same resources. The resource could be food, water, mates, or really anything that they both would need. And this occurs when they both try to get the same resource in the same place at the same time. And that's just, we all know what a competition is. The organism with better adaptations may win out over the organism that does not have very good adaptations. So when we look at how life is organized, we start with the most basic unit of living things, which is the cell. A group of cells make up tissues. A group of tissues make up organs. A group of organs make organ systems. and a bunch of organ systems make up organisms. And so this is kind of, I always call it like the Russian nesting dolls, where it's like those, got a bunch of little things stacked inside a bigger thing. And so the smallest, the most inside piece would be the cell. Outside the cell is the tissue. Outside of tissue is an organ. And then an organ system and organism. So again, here could be your picture. Here's your cell, which makes up a tissue. A bunch of these tissues make up the organ, which I believe here is the stomach. This stomach is part of the organ system, the digestive system. And a bunch of organ systems put together makes up an organism. So after we get past an organism, organisms can further be organized. And next would be populations. Populations are a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same geographical area. A community then is all of the different populations that live together in the same area. Then an ecosystem takes all of the communities plus the non-living environment. So like the rocks, the water, the weather. And that all gets grouped into a biome or a group of similar ecosystems. And then the biosphere, bio again, remember, means life. Sphere of life would be anywhere on the earth where life exists. And so here we have this diagram where we have the individual, we have the fish, the population is all of the same species of fish in a given location. That population is part of the community, which has this population of fish, this population, all combined. It's all in the aquatic ecosystem. And then, aquatic. And then all of this would be part of all of the oceans. And then your biosphere would be the whole entire earth where life exists. So life is very diverse, and we call this biodiversity. And it has to be very diverse because of all the different places where life can exist. There's at least 10 million different species, and they get grouped into, let's say, 3 domains and 4 kingdoms. And so your 4 kingdoms are plants, animals, and we have fungus, and lastly we have something called protists. We did talk about them in 7th grade. Your 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So life has been on Earth for quite some time, and it's very diverse because of evolution. Life began about 4 billion years ago, and the early life was simple, single-celled organisms, which later evolved into multicellular life. And so this gives you kind of a graphic. If you start back here billions of years ago, there's not really any life. Then as you go, the sun ignites, the earth is formed, the moon is formed. Then we have our first prokaryote or single-celled organism. And you go through and see, here we have oxygen in the atmosphere. And go on through and see how life has evolved. So the idea of evolution isn't new. It's been around since about Aristotle's time, but it was really Charles Darwin in, I believe, like 1856. He published the book On the Origin of Species, and this stated the theory of evolution by natural selection. It wasn't very well received.
because in it stated that humans had ape-like ancestors, and it also contradicted the current religious teachings. Scientists have continued to gather evidence for evolution since Darwin's book. Some of the biggest evidence for evolution include fossils, and then genetic similarities. And so this has come about with modern advances in science and ways to look at molecular items and DNA. So because of this genetic testing, humans and chimpanzees share about 98% of their genes they have in common. And so that indicates we had a relatively recent common ancestor. And so a way to think about a common ancestor is that somewhere along this chain of life, we had an ancestor. And something caused that. Some change in the environment caused some of those ancestors to go off one way and the other set to go off a second way. And this, whatever caused this divide, has caused an evolution of two different species. Species 1 over here, species 2 over there. And so it's kind of a branching. And so this doesn't mean we came from chimpanzees. It means that we had a common ancestor with chimpanzees. So there are still misconceptions about evolution. Today, evolution is still questioned by some people. One is because they have a lack of knowledge about evolution. Some people think evolution explains how life on Earth first began. However, it really explains how life has changed after it first appeared. And then they really like to think that humans evolved from apes. And this is where that whole common ancestor came in, or comes into play. Humans and modern apes have a common ancestor that lived several million years ago. So remember, here was that common ancestor. Then some event caused a divide in this group of common ancestors, and some of them branched this way and some of them branched that way. And both of those branches evolved different characteristics and led to the humans off one side and the apes off the other. So no, we did not evolve from apes.